politics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined today by both Ken Katkin, a professor at law at Chase Law School, and Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Hey, Trey.
Hey. Well, it's exciting. We're going to actually have another three-way Politics Guys episode, I think in large part because we're all a little bit eager to talk impeachment, right? I mean, this has been, I think, the oxygen in the political room for some time. And as listeners might know, I even had the opportunity to be in D.C. For the vote on witnesses and for that entire day. And so I actually had done a quick take just on that from D.C. So I have my own kind of point of view. I think some of our supporters have heard that. So I'm going to let you guys start off. What do you think about the resolution this week to impeachment? We do, in fact, have a crossover. There's some ramifications for that in Mitt Romney. So, Ken, why don't you start?
Well, I mean, I was satisfied with the resolution. You know, I favored impeachment and removal, and he didn't get removed. So, you know, that could be disappointing. But of course, it was never a serious prospect that he would be removed. And I think the House managers, made the case. And I think the fact that Mitt Romney became the first senator in American history to vote to remove a president of his own party, thereby making it a bipartisan vote for removal, I was pleased with that. I was also pleased with the fact that the 48 senators who voted for removal were elected by 69 million Americans, and that's 7 million Americans more than ever voted for Donald Trump. So I took some consolation from that as well.
I'm glad that math made you feel better about that, Ken. I don't. But so, Michael, what were your feelings on the impeachment, any portion of it, or the outcome specifically here?
I got to say, guys, I am so incredibly conflicted. It seems like from the 2 weeks ago, I was just full of fire and fury and saying, God, he should be convicted. And I would do that. And then the next week, I went through this, what I thought was rational analysis and said, well, no, actually, I wouldn't vote to convict him if I were in the senator's position. And now I don't know. I heard what Romney said and I thought about that. And this is really one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to come to. And I didn't even have to decide anything. It's like there are any stakes for me. I'm just the guy, right? But here's my problem, guys, and maybe you can help me out with this. I'm hoping you can. I'm torn between the severity of the offense, and this is an offense I have no doubt was committed. You know, a while ago, Ken and I just privately talked about my earlier concerns that the evidentiary standard hadn't been met. I don't have that concern anymore. But there's the severity of the very real offense that I weigh against the severity of the very anti-democratic remedy, because, of course, it's not just removing the president from office. It's ensuring that or saying that the president is not allowed to hold any federal office again. That's a big deal. And that's the source of my conflict. So, you know, I'm kind of in a sort of Lamar Alexander-ish sort of place here, I guess. And that's really what's giving me a lot of trouble.
So, you see, for me, I don't think I had quite the same moral conundrum you did there, Mike. What I find interesting about this is how, for me, it's emblematic of the political parties just not being consistent. I think that's probably what bothered me most of all, because here's Romney. And I think by looking at him, we actually get a pretty good assessment of how the political landscape has shifted in the Trump and now in the post-Trump, post-impeachment era. There we go. There's a term that's going to take off. And effectively, it's this. When Romney ran for office, he gets lambasted from the left because he's a Cold War thinker, because he's worried about Russia, because things that at the time seemingly were quaint. And so now he's the same Romney. He's the same guy and he's still worried about those things, and he's worried about them in the context of this president, and he gets disinvited from the CPAC. So the right has shifted in its position. And so I guess for me, what kind of just bothers me about the process, and I do give some Romney for this going down in history as being the first to switch over, is it just shows how radically the political parties have just melted their positions. And I think that gives me the greatest discomfort in the wake of impeachment.
I just got to say, Trey, it seems kind of like a false equivalency to me. I mean, I feel you can make that argument to a certain extent, but what almost all the Republicans have done, how they have basically shut their eyes to what seems to me, from any reasonable person's standpoint, the clear and serious criminality of Donald Trump and his administration is staggering to me, and far outweighs, I think, anything that Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi, or anyone else has done. So I guess I'm struggling to understand how I get how some Republicans could maybe come to the conclusion that this serious crime is not as serious as the remedy, but how do so many members of your party just say, nothing to see here, just let's move on?
Oh, well, I'm arguing explicitly that I think that they have fundamentally shifted their positions in a way that is morally repugnant. That's my point. I think Romney is the consistent one here, and the party has shifted around him. In other words, I think that those who would have, should have, were right when he was running for president, pointing out that his positions in a positive way have completely shifted. And so, I mean, that I don't disagree with you. In no way am I attempting to indicate by saying that I think that is an indication that Democrats in this case are wrong. Rather, what I'm saying is that we're just seeing the party fundamentally transform what it is.
Yeah, well, Trey, if I could, I think maybe there was a subtext in what you were saying, that if the Democrats thought Romney was such a bad person in 2012 and couldn't be voted for, then there's some hypocrisy perhaps in extolling him now. But I'm not even sure that's true, because I don't think the rap on Romney in 2012 was that he was an unethical person. I think it was more just that he was, a very rich man who was out of touch with.
And in part of the way he was out of touch was, he had these wild, weird Cold War era problems, worrying about the future of security with places like Russia, which is, he was right. And
he was right. But I'm saying I don't think Democrats ever painted him as not being a person of integrity. So I think Democrats being willing to, really extol him as a person of integrity today, I don't think that's a 180-degree shift from what because I don't think that was the criticism of him back then. I don't think they ever said he's not a person of integrity. I think they just said he had bad ideas, and now maybe they've come around some to his ideas about Russia. For sure.
I think that's been the shift on their part. Is I think they have recognized he was right. I think it's just unfortunate that they're going to do it in a moment when now it effectively doesn't matter. But I mean, the larger problem here, of course, and I think that's what you're pointing out, Mike, is effectively that Republicans are not willing to have an open and honest process about this. I mean, as I was watching it happen in the Senate, it just baffled my mind that we were not going to have witnesses. I mean, again, if you want to vote to not convict, we can have a complicated conversation about, whether or not we've met that evidentiary standard. But how do you determine what it is? And as they were sitting there, and the defense's argument was effectively, look, if you open up witnesses, we're going to make this go on forever, and we're going to make you suffer. And that's just a staggering. I mean, it wasn't an attempt to hide that claim. That was exactly the claim. Right? We're going to call this person and this person and this person and this person, and you all are going to sit here and listen to it. That was effectively their argument. And that part baffles me.
Yeah, well, I did not like a trial without witnesses, and there's never been an impeachment trial without witnesses. And, even though there have only been a few presidential impeachments, there have been about 20 judicial impeachments. So there's a fair amount of experience with impeachment trials in the Senate. And this is completely unprecedented and improper. The one thing I thought was interesting was Lamar Alexander, kind of uniquely among the Republicans, when he was explaining his vote against having witnesses, he said there's no need for witnesses because the Democrats have already completely proved all the factual aspects of their case, and therefore there's nothing that witnesses would add to that because Trump's already been proven guilty on the facts, and it's merely up to the Senate to decide whether that renders removable or not. I could respect that position, although I still think there ought to be witnesses.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, think the fundamental problem. I'm so sorry, Mike. Continue.
No, I was going to say that's essentially my position at this point. So I respect that position.
I mean, the thing that fundamentally frustrates me is the idea that we now have this precedent that suggests that the House is not the grand jury, but rather both the grand jury and the trial. And I'm not really sure what the Senate assumes its role in that place is to be. I mean, historically speaking, clearly the House is intended to be a grand jury, not to be the place where you prove charges. You're bringing charges on enough evidence to suggest that there's more careful investigation is needed. And I think effectively the Senate wrote out a big bit of power. And so one of the questions I had for both of you, I mean, do you think moving forward, the Senate has effectively, once again, and this is a trajectory we've talked about in the show before, handed future presidents additional power because they've basically absconded their role and set a new precedent?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to depend on whether the Senate is in the same political party as the president, as it did this time. But yeah, if they are, I think there is a precedent here now that any Senate that's inclined not to remove the president is probably going to have a very minimal proceeding like this.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just part of a larger trend where we've seen for a long time now that this notion that there would be institutional rivalries that would check the executive. I think that's sort of gone away when you have a branch or an entire or part of a branch that's of the same party. That party loyalty clearly takes precedence over any sort of prerogatives or powers of the institution.
Well, then, I mean, I guess, man, we're once again in agreement on something I was hoping that we'd have.
Well, let me ask you, Trey. If you were going to be voting on this, now, because, of course, Romney only voted to convict on one charge, and that was the abuse of power and not obstruction of Congress. Now, I'm curious how you would have voted on those two things. Were you in his position, or So
here is, I mean, I guess there's two votes I'd have to answer your question on. One is, I suppose if I was in the Senate, I would have voted for witnesses, and I would have been the tipping vote. And so, and I think the part of the conundrum that I find myself in is that to really answer that question fully, I think there needed to be additional witnesses. Now, if what appears to be the case, what Bolton is saying off the record and through a book that's coming out, maybe, then that would influence how I would have voted. Had they not allowed witnesses to go forward, I think I probably would have voted like Romney on one and not the other, simply to make a protest vote. But I think I would have followed his example pretty closely in other words, if we just swapped shoes, I think he did the right thing. Not because he couldn't have voted yes on both, but because I think in part he's saying, hey, I don't know because we didn't have a trial. And I think that's fair.
You see, that's where, and Ken, I'm sure this resonates with you for our earlier conversation about the evidence. It's hard for me, and this is where I agree with Alexander again, it's hard for me to understand what Bolton really could have added. I mean, if at this point, with all the testimony and all the documentary evidence, it's not clear to anyone who's paying attention that President Trump engaged in a plan, a plot, a scheme, whatever you want to call it, to abuse his power in a very serious way. I don't understand what evidence they're looking at, I guess. And Ken, that was the point you made to me, I don't know, a couple of months ago.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the one thing that Bolton could have added, but I don't think this would be dispositive for almost anybody, is that all the other testimony you heard were from people who weren't directly the office holders themselves who were engaging in the conduct. Now, Mulvaney, although he didn't testify, he gave a press conference where he he is one of the people. He blocked the money and he admitted it. That wasn't under oath, but it was in a press conference. Bolton also would have been someone in a position to be a player in all these events. The people who did testify in the House were mostly people who were witnesses to these events rather than players in these events. So some people might have thought it's important to hear straight from the horse's mouth, and Bolton is the horse's mouth. But I feel it was sufficient to hear from all the witnesses. I don't think it needed to be straight from one of the players.
Yeah, and that's where I agree with you absolutely. Though even though our votes would have been very different, because in that balance, I'm sure you agree with me that the penalty is very severe, but you feel that the offense is so grave that it merits the penalty, and I'm incredibly on the fence about that.
Well, let me add, if I can, that it's not just about what the offense is. It's about what it signifies about whether this person is fit to remain in office or whether they will keep doing it if they remain in office. And I think that was proved. So I'd sort of partly go by what the offense is, but I'd also partly go by what the offense signifies about what to expect if this person gets to stay in office.
Yeah, that's not a bad point. I guess, and in trying to work through my conflict, I feel like if I am undecided, then I should give the benefit of the doubt to the will of the people, even though I think they screwed it up. I don't agree with their will in 2016, but that's kind of why I fell where I did. And after going back and forth a little bit on that.
Well, maybe they just need to bring you into the Rousseauian true will, and then.
God, no.
Well, I do want to add something that has actually happened today on impeachment, and I think it really resonates with what you two were having a minor disagreement about. And that is, did either of you see that Vindman was escorted from the White House today after President Donald Trump suggested that there is going to be retribution outright to members of the press. And so he and, as a matter of fact, his brother have been removed today. It just happened about 45 minutes ago. So does this have any bearing on what you guys are talking about? Because one of the things you were saying there, Ken, Mike, was, well, would he do it again? Is it a pattern of behavior? Well, does this fall into that pattern of behavior? Or is this just a president who's removing guys from his staff? That's something we've been talking about in my presidency class.
I mean, I think this is an example of what I was talking about. I think it's even though I would acknowledge that anyone on the National Security Council serves at the pleasure of the president and can be removed at the pleasure of the president. I think it's completely obvious here that Vindman is being humiliated to the maximum extent possible. He was literally escorted out by security, not simply just told, well, the president doesn't want you on his staff anymore. Literally escorted out by security solely because he responded to a congressional subpoena and testified truthfully. Now, I think that's an outrageous abuse of power, but I think it's consistent with my idea that Trump is going to keep abusing power.
Mike, what do you think about that?
I disagree. I mean, in a sense, I certainly agree with Ken that all of those people serve at the pleasure of the president. And so while I feel that how he went about doing what he did is incorrect, I don't feel it's I don't feel it's an abuse of power. I feel it's petty and in horrific taste and entirely in keeping with what we know about Donald Trump as a person. But I don't think it's actually an abuse of power because he has the power to do this. And I think it's absolutely reasonable that he would have lost the trust of in Vindman, and so it makes sense as a policy move.
But now, does this kind of effectively, because this goes back to the question I asked both of you a minute ago, if responding to subpoenas puts you in political jeopardy permanently, doesn't this once again just simply consolidate additional power in the hands of the presidency, regardless of who's holding the office?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Trump is determined to obstruct Congress. He's improperly telling everybody who works for him, don't respond to lawful subpoenas, don't respond to lawful document requests. Those are improper abuses of power, those instructions. And then he's saying if anybody won't be an accomplice in that illegality, then he's going to get rid of them because they don't have his confidence anymore. I think that's pretty open and shut.
Yeah, I agree with you on the first part of that. Certainly, telling people to ignore a lawful request to testify, that is, in my view, an abuse of power. Which is, I think it's unquestionable that he was guilty of doing both of those things he was charged with, not just abuse of power, but also obstructing Congress. And of course, it's kind of they kind of meld together in a way.
So now I know that we're going to need to kind of wrap this particular topic up, but here I think is maybe the down and dirty last question that we need to consider is, does any of this matter in 2020 in electoral terms? Mike, you first.
Well, I mean, the president's job approval is about as high as it's ever been in his presidency, although it's still like mid 40s. So it doesn't surprise me in the sense that you would expect him to get a little bit of a bump right after with all the news and so forth. But I don't see it making a huge difference really either way. So I think no, not so much in the longer term.
Yeah, I agree exactly, and I even think even the little bump in the polls, besides I think being temporary and ephemeral, like Mike was saying, I'm not even sure I think it's real. I mean, you see it in the numbers, but what you also see in the numbers, and I think this is some somewhat documented phenomenon in the past as well, is that when one side gets a little bit more despondent and another side gets a little more energized, that actually affects response rates to who's willing to answer polls. Yeah. So that you may just be a little bit more Republicans willing to answer polls now, and so that affects what the polls look like also.
So what do you think, Trey?
I honestly don't think this is going to let me put it. I think this will ultimately help Trump on the path to what I am seeing as an increasing likelihood for a Trump 2020 victory.
Okay, because the betting markets actually agree with you. They have Donald Trump as a favorite, but that doesn't surprise me given how fractured the Democratic field is right now. I think that's going to change. But so you think this will? I don't think it'll help him at all. In fact, I think there's very likely that we will get a Democratic president, assuming Bernie Sanders isn't the nominee. And if he is, that's a whole different story. But we'll talk about that.
Well,
I'm sure at some other point.
I know we're going to shift to Iowa and then talking about that and presidential chances. But before we do that, Mike, why don't you tell us about our sponsor?
Yeah, our sponsor today is Empower. And, I could use more money, and I bet you could too. So let Empower help you save a bunch of money and make money management the easiest thing you do all day. All you do is put in your weekly savings target. Then every day Empower studies your income and spending and automatically moves the right amount of money into your savings account, where obviously you're going to be less likely to spend it. They've also got budgeting for people who hate budgeting, and that's definitely me. They've got great reports that have actionable spending insights, smart spending recommendations tailored especially for you. They can even negotiate on your behalf to lower your bills. They also give you personalized human coaching for any financial questions you might have, and high interest FDIC insured checking with no minimums. So if you want to save big this year, download Empower, that's EMPOWER, in the App Store or Play Store. I downloaded it, and so have 650,000 other people, give or take. And Politics Guys listeners, you get $5 when you use offer code Politics Guys and reach your savings goal. So just visit empower.me/Politics Guys for more details.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Now all they need to do is help me figure out how to save for this $1,000 multi-sport watch that I've been looking for, and Empower will be mine too. No, that actually sounds pretty cool. So moving away from Empower and back to the Iowa caucuses, which I think is going to lead us to chatting a little bit about who's going to win, maybe who's going to win. This is going to take us a minute, I think, because it was kind of even hard thinking about how to phrase this story. The Iowa caucus is weird for a lot of reasons. For one reason, it's not a primary. And so the way this works, I think, can be weird to a lot of the country. What happens in the Iowa caucus is that local party members express their support by gathering around in a large room, and you actually move to different parts of the room to indicate your support for different candidates. Anybody, or I should say any candidate, who doesn't receive 15% of the vote is eliminated, and those individuals can then have a chance to move in the room and vote again. Now, traditionally, what has happened is at that point, those votes are recorded and transmitted by phone through an automated system for a final tally. Now, this year, though, there were two major changes. One was there was a new app that was designed to collect the data instead of phoning it in. And two, on top of that new app, there was going to be some additional data points collected. And those were now, in addition to the final outcome, it'd be the initial support for each candidate, and then the second choice for those who realigned, and also the final delegates of who won. And all of this was supposed to go through the app. Now, this has led to numerous problems. The New York Times was the first to kind of really delve into this, but everybody realized something was going on when the results aren't coming in. It's to note that, this app has all kinds of questions surrounding it. Cybersecurity experts didn't have a chance to look at it. As a matter of fact, not even my cybersecurity OC kids had a chance to look at it. Just want to throw that out there. They are for hire if anybody wants it. I mean, I'm just looking at you, Iowa. But they didn't even test it. Now, additionally, and this is even worse, is that just like some of my students, state chairs did the worst thing ever. They waited until the last moment and didn't download the app. As a matter of fact, none of them had even been trained in its use in advance. Now, additionally, what came out post the caucus is not only were there app errors, but there appears to be, although the DNC in Iowa is denying, or excuse me, the Democratic Party in Iowa is denying it, is that there were in fact errors in the very count themselves. Not systematic, but errors in the count. So all the way around, things are not looking particularly good, gentlemen, for Iowa. And in all honesty, I mean, could this finally be us being done with the Iowa caucus being the first test for primaries, or is this just a bump in the road? Obviously we have the questions of the technology, we have the questions of this change, and we have the question of, well, what does any of this even mean when it comes to, do we have a winner in the candidates?
I got to say, Trey, if it means that Iowa doesn't go first anymore, I'm going to count it as a win.
I'll second that motion.
Go ahead, Ken.
Oh, I was just saying, I have a strange sentimental attachment to the caucus process. Because I think it does have some benefits, but I'm going to agree with probably both you guys that by now the detriments outweigh the benefits. But I think the one benefit that's going to get lost, a little bit of the baby that's going to go with the bathwater, is I think it's nice that there's a juncture early in the process where the influence of money is very much diminished, right? Because in Iowa, you've got the ability for all the candidates to go there, to spend some time there, to meet a relatively small number of voters. And that completely, I think, countervails against the advantages that would accrue normally to whoever can pay for the most media. And so I think that was a good thing about caucuses, but ultimately they are very undemocratic, unworkable. And you got to really ask, is Iowa too unrepresentative, and having just caucus goers who are the most active voters, are they unrepresentative of the more mainstream voters? And there are a lot of problems there. And I think it probably should go and will go.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. You can still take some of those positives. I think that you're absolutely right about it being good to have a setting that's small enough where everyone can compete, if not equally, at least on a more equal footing. But of course, that doesn't have to be Iowa, right? There are a number of other states that might fit that bill and would be at least a bit more diverse, if nothing else, at least geographically.
So what about, and this is where I think probably the two of you are going to have a bigger dog in the fight. So what do you think about the process for the changes that occurred in Iowa? So obviously we all kind of agree that there's problematics, but this is the way it works. This is what happened. But we have the app and we have these reporting issues. What does that mean for 2020 where we can't go back and change it?
I don't think it means much at all. It's just, it's the big thing that's happening right now. But as soon as we have the vote in New Hampshire, it's pretty much gone. And in the larger scheme of things, as you guys know, Iowa is not that big of a deal, at least from a sheer delegate point of view. It's 41 out of 1,990 that you need. And so it's being, I'll say, not saying it's not a bad thing, but it's being overplayed because it's what's happening right now and it's the first contest. But I don't really see it being as big of a deal as a lot of other people do.
Ken,
I think I mostly agree. I think it can be a big deal only in a few small ways. It is going to help Buttigieg now with fundraising and with establishing himself as a more major candidate that he did so well there. I think I think other candidates like Yang, who didn't really do much there. It's already starting to feel like the end of the road for them. And I do think that if Biden doesn't bounce back quickly, it's going to deal him a blow. I mean, if he bounces back in New Hampshire, then Iowa's not going to matter. But if Biden does poorly in Iowa and New Hampshire, it's going to hobble him a little bit, I think.
Well, and this is an interesting. I'm sorry. Finish, Mike. Finish.
No, I was going to say what I thought was interesting is that both Biden and Warren put a lot into Iowa. They organized there early and very well, and they were head and shoulders above everyone else, especially early on. And we saw that paying off for Buttigieg, but we didn't see it paying off for Warren. And I think that gets to some other issues where I think Warren just doesn't feel as authentic, because I don't think she is as authentic necessarily as Buttigieg. Not saying that that's necessarily a primary factor, but it certainly matters to a lot of voters, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have Buttigieg coming in with 26.2%, Sanders with 26.1%. Warren and Biden are both just barely scraping in at 18 and 15.8. And if you're taking a look at the polls, I don't know if you guys have done this, but as we're looking at the polls right now, New Hampshire, it's Sanders is out front with Buttigieg in second in the polls. And Warren and Biden don't look like they may compete as well in New Hampshire either. So this leads to something that you were talking about a minute ago. You were asking me about Trump, and then you were saying, well, we're not going to have Trump unless there's a Sanders. Sanders is not the candidate. Are you feeling nervous, Mike?
I'm not so much. It's a long race, and people get all excited and jump on various bandwagons and so forth. And I take sort of a longer view. I still think it's Joe Biden's race to lose. And I've been saying for a long time now that we'll know a lot more, certainly after South Carolina, and seeing if Buttigieg can translate any of his support in Iowa and probably New Hampshire down to a very different electorate there. And I think that's going to be a big problem. But really, I think we're going to be I'll be either a lot more or a lot less nervous after Super Tuesday, when we'll know so much more than we know now.
What do you think, Ken?
Yeah, Mike's saying it's Biden's to lose, and I guess I agree with that, but I do think he's going to lose it. I've always thought that. I just think that he's not up to the challenges of really being on the road and retail campaigning. He makes a lot of gaffes. And another thing about Iowa that was unique this time out is that all of the sitting senators were really tied up in Washington because of the impeachment. So that gave a big advantage to Biden and to Buttigieg, because they could be there the whole time in Iowa, and none of the other leading contenders could. And Buttigieg obviously did capitalize on that. And Biden's failure to do that when he really had the field more to himself than he should have does seem a little bit like it signifies something, although it could just be a blip. I certainly wouldn't write him off at this point, but I've never really thought he could go the distance.
And so, okay, that is not what I was expecting either of you guys to say, to be real honest. Yeah, I mean, when you look at the polls right now, I mean, doing the state-by-state matchups, Biden is just fading in these early goes. And I thought, in full disclosure, I was not as convinced as you were, Ken. And, we talked about that. I didn't think that Biden was going to fade quite this quickly. And you're right. I mean, we have senators in Washington that pulls them away. But well, then how do you explain Sanders tying Buttigieg if he's in the same boat as Warren?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do think Sanders had a few structural advantages that the others didn't have. The other senators didn't have, that is. He had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Michael Moore making all of his appearances for him. And I don't know that the other candidates who missed appearances had anybody as charismatic as that showing up at all of the scheduled events that they already had scheduled and that they had to miss. And I think for Sanders voters, or for potential Sanders voters, there was a lot of excitement going in Iowa, going to, some small town event where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Michael Moore are there. They could put on a pretty big show. They had a lot of big rock stars playing at those events and things like that. So I think Sanders had a better backup team in terms of filling in and making those appearances than the other senators. I also think that the Iowa caucus structure, which does bring out, it weights the views of activists much more than it weights the votes of ordinary voters. That does play to Sanders's advantages, I think.
So on 2 points, I have response one is so you don't think that Warren's dog was an effective replacement at the two campaign stops? Anyway, sorry. It was true. It really happened. The other one is, and this is a completely unrepresentative sample, but in the Senate galley, I had tons of people cycling through me. And at every moment that I could whisper and not have a gun pointed at my head, I would ask people, and every single person who I had a conversation with all said, in my heart of hearts, the one that I want is Buttigieg. And I found that really interesting. That was not what I was expecting either. So you had these, again, admittedly, this is a weird makeup because we have people who were driving from the New England area in. So it's a very kind of limited geographic space for the people who were also there, because you're not going to fly like that unless you have a ticket. So, but all of them, there was not a single person that I talked to that put their money on anybody else, even though they're in the Senate looking at the other senators. I don't know that.
I'm going to make two. I'm going to make two predictions here, Trey, and you and Ken can hold me to them. Number one, no one is going to get the pledged delegates they need to win on the first ballot. And number two, Joe Biden will be the nominee.
Oh, wow. I love it.
I don't mess around, man.
So we've got, I feel like we're going to need to have a Ken versus Mike after the election debate, Who was right and who wrong?
Actually, let me ask you guys a question, because this is something I've been wondering, and I don't have an answer. It seems like Bloomberg is in now, and people are only just starting to pay him a little bit of attention. It seems to me like Bloomberg is going for the voters, mainly the same voters that Biden or that Buttigieg are going for. That they're all going for the center wing of the party. Maybe Buttigieg is kind of pivoting a little bit between the center wing and a little bit between the more left wing, but basically those guys are going for the center. Do you think Bloomberg's going to get any traction, and is he going to have? If so, who's he going to take the votes away from?
See, what I think is going to happen, I'm glad you brought him up, Ken, because what I think is going to happen is that he's not going to get quite enough traction, and so that's going to end up going in support of Biden, because it seems to me pretty clear that from the beginning, Michael Bloomberg knew that he had a outside at best chance of winning, and his main thing wasn't so much winning, though, hey, that would be nice, but I don't know if you're the 15th richest person in the world. Does it really matter if you're president or not? You're probably more powerful in some ways, but I think that his goal all along has been to make sure that Donald Trump loses. And so I think he's going to direct his massive funds to whoever he thinks is going to be most likely to make that happen. And of course, he'd like that to be Mike Bloomberg. When he finds out that it's not, I think he's going to conclude that it's Joe Biden, and that's going to give Biden a big bump. And like I said, he'll end up being.
And it's a weird disconnect we currently have when you're looking at the national polling data for Democrats. Bloomberg does really well. I mean, he's polling at nearly 11%. But when you take a look at the state by state breakdown, he's not really cracking the top three. And so right now, I mean, you're right. There's a disconnect between national polls and state polls. And in my opinion, you take a look at the state polls.
Well, and that'll change, too, because as we get closer to Super Tuesday, we're going to start to see a lot more polling in those states. And I think that Bloomberg is going to pop up a lot higher. And so that gap is going to close a little bit. But I don't think it's going to close enough. And I think he'll end up making the strategic calculation at some point that he's not going to be the nominee. And then his massive resources are really going to help out whoever I think he decides to support. And I think that's going to end up being Biden.
Well, I think it's probably time for us to turn our attention to our third story, which is that this week, Attorney General Barr issued some new rules for politically sensitive investigations, as NPR puts it. What happened is Barr outlined some new policies in a 3-page memo. And what it basically says is effectively that Barr's restrictions would change the way that investigations into candidates would operate. And specifically, it appears that the Attorney General is going to kind of have the final say on things that are coming from any kind of investigation. What do you guys think about this shift? I mean, obviously, the kind of the scuttle here is that it's coming in the wake of the IG report, but it also feels a little bit maybe like part of we're not going to investigate candidates anymore, or at least we're going to make that bar high enough that that's not going to happen easily.
Ever since I heard this, I got to say, I've been waiting to hear Ken's take on this. So, Ken, I think you should definitely start us off.
Well, and then, Michael, I actually told you my take already, but now I'll tell it Trey as well. So, no, I think it's the opposite. It's to weaponize and politicize the Justice Department so that only Democrats can be investigated for partisan political purposes, and Republicans can never be investigated for partisan political purposes as long as Barr is Attorney General. I think it's as simple as that, and that it's actually codifying the exact conduct that the Republicans have been screaming about, that where they say the FBI and the Justice Department launched an investigation against Trump and people around Trump during the campaign because they were partisan and because they wanted to interfere with Trump's candidacy. Barr is saying that's what I'm going to do now. That's what I'm going to do to Democrats, and that will not be done to Republicans. And that's really what the new rules signify. The last thing I could say, and I know I'm taking up a lot of time here, but almost the same day that he announced these rules, I'm sure that the Justice Department has been advising the Treasury Department. There were two different congressional subpoenas. There's the one that people have known about for a year, where the House Ways and Means Committee has been trying to see Donald Trump's tax returns. And then there's a more recent one where the Senate Judiciary Committee asked to see Hunter Biden's tax returns under exactly the same statute. And, the Barr, I'm sure, told the Treasury Department the same day he announced these rules, yeah, you got to give him Hunter Biden's tax returns and, still don't give him Donald Trump's tax returns. And I think that's sort of the way this rule is supposed to work.
What do you think?
That was my take. And yeah, that was exactly my take, although, Ken obviously is able to express it far better. And so I was wondering, Trey, how you would respond to that, actually.
I'm going to be honest. I don't often take the side of the Trump administration, but I think if it wasn't Barr who was doing this, I don't think that either of you would be as likely to read at least the bits of the memo that I can get my hands on in that light that you're pointing out. I think in large part this is part of the problem of what had happened during the Barack Obama administration, which is, well, what do we do? I think they were doing the best they were attempting to do. What do you do with that? Who's the ultimate arbiter of deciding we're going to have a candidate or not have a candidate? I think if it wasn't Barr, I think that most of us would be a little bit more okay with it. Now, of course, maybe I'm talking myself out of it in the sense that if you think that if a rule wouldn't be applicable across the board to any person, would you want that rule? Yeah.
I mean, I think right now, and Ken, I'm hoping you can speak to this, but as it stands now, there are certain standards that the career employees make in terms of the termination, as well as some of their political superiors, and it's based on their judgment in those standards and not the political sign off of the president's top appointee in the department.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with that entirely. And in terms of what Trey said, I agree with half of what Trey said. So I think it's true that I wouldn't be as suspicious if it wasn't Barr that was putting out this memo. I think that's exactly right. But yet it is Barr that's putting out this memo, and I think that has to be taken account of. Because otherwise, the status quo before this memo already would have required some politically appointed, high-ranking official in the Justice Department to sign off on these things. It just wouldn't have been the Attorney General. And now that we have a highly partisan Attorney General who's trying to weaponize the Justice Department as an adjunct of the Republican Party in all kinds of ways, and then he puts out this order, I think it has to be read in that context.
Yeah. I think it's important to point out that the higher up you go in the appointments, the more political they become in almost any department. And so you can find a lot of assistants and lower level, still political appointees who aren't nearly as intent on carrying water for the president, whatever his party may be, than the top appointee in any department is.
I mean, I hear what you guys are saying, but I think part of the problem is that you're kind of hoping that the executive branch is going to check the executive branch. And that by making this lower down, that somehow these kinds of political considerations aren't going to be happening. And I just don't buy that theory of the presidency that we want to have this massive EOP, executive office of the president, that's somehow sitting across from the president attempting to fix the president. I mean, so effectively, I guess what I'm saying is if you don't like the way that the presidency is operating, then you either A, have a problem with the scope and the expansion of the presidency, which I do, or you have a problem with the person who's holding it. And I don't think it's right to suggest that you ought to have particular frameworks to stop the president from pulling the levers that has been handed to him in the EOP.
Oh, it sounds to me like, Trey, that like you're saying that, well, there are problems with the system the way it is, so let's make it worse. I agree with you in some extent. To me, what I really think we should do is what 43 of the 50 states have done and have an elected attorney general, because I think you're right in terms of the inherent politicization of this. And so I would love to see politics, well, not taken out of, but removed at least by, to a certain extent, by having an independent elected attorney general. And we have seen in a number of states how that has checked the power of governors. And I'm thinking, and you'll appreciate this, Ken, certainly our own state of, in Kentucky where we work, we've certainly seen that. Now, obviously, that's a big change and it would require a constitutional amendment, but that is an amendment I would totally get behind.
I agree with you.
Actually,
I agree with you 100%.
Trey and I have actually talked about this on prior episodes, and we both agree with that too. And I think that another benefit of that is that it also breaks up this theory of the unitary executive, right? Yes. So right now we have a constitutional theory that all of the power is vested in the president and delegates down, and so everybody in the administration has to, at some level, be an agent of the president. I think that's a terrible theory of the executive branch. It is more or less the theory that is in our Constitution. But if we had a constitutional amendment that changed that, I think that would only be for the better. And the example of changing it so that we would elect attorneys general, and I think we should elect them at the midterm elections, not at the same election as the president. Yeah. So that people can decide halfway through a president's term whether they'd like to elect a different attorney general who would start investigating that president. I think that would be a great improvement to our Constitution.
I deeply agree with the idea that
we're all in agreement.
But here's where I disagree with you a little bit, Ken. I don't think that's part of our constitutional framework. I think that has been the slow accumulation of precedents, and we have allowed our president to rest on precedents over what I think actually was its intended purposes. But okay, that's maybe a question for an upper level grad class.
Well, I find your theory more attractive than the framers' theory, I think. But I do think the framers in the Constitution, in Article 2, it does say the executive power of the United States is vested in one president of the United States.
Well, it says the power is vested, but they then go on to list in Article 2 a specific set of powers, which means that they can't mean what the unitary theorists argue, which is that all executive powers were intended. Otherwise, why do you list them?
Right. Well, in other words, all the powers that the executive has are vested in one president, I think is what they came up with. And they did actually debate the idea of an executive triumvirate and at the Constitutional Convention. And George Washington was opposed because the Roman triumvirates had usually wound up with one living triumvir and two dead triumvirs.
Well, but see, I'll take another issue. I mean, even there, I believe it's Federalist 72, although later they're going to disagree with themselves, argues explicitly what we were talking about earlier, that presidents will not have the power to, without the approval of the Senate, to remove officials. Now, of course, that goes by the wayside as a result of precedent. But I mean, if you're going to take the words of the guys who are writing the Federalist Papers at face value, clearly they weren't intending even all of those powers to mean the ability just to remove somebody to be solely the president's.
I think sometimes these debates, and a lot of people focus a lot on what the framers intended. And I feel like sometimes that can be a useful debate, but maybe not the best debate to have, because their political universe was in a lot of respects very different. And so regardless of what the framers may have intended or thought or wanted to see happen, the world as we see it in 2020 politically is, there are some new realities, I think, that require changes to institutional arrangements that might have made a whole lot of sense in the 18th, 19th, or even 20th centuries.
Yeah, and I think we all agree on that change. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Continue, Ken.
Yeah. I was just going to say that's why, even though, and I agree with Mike, maybe it's a digression, but even though I'm a little more sympathetic to the idea that the framers wanted a unitary executive, I don't think that we benefit from a unitary executive. So I definitely would like to see that change.
So we disagree about the means.
We just need someone to write it up, I guess, right? And introduce it.
Well, I mean, who knows? Well, I think the last thing that we're going to want to talk about as we get near to the end of the show is the State of the Union address. And never have I felt more like we're going to be talking about reality TV than I am now for the last issue. So we have a big moment, I think two kind of big moments, but really, are they big or are they just media big? And I think that maybe that's something we can even talk about. But we have Donald Trump not shaking Nancy Pelosi's hand. And then we have Nancy Pelosi very now, I think, famously and meme-inducingly ripping up the president's speech. As a matter of fact, after ripping up the speech, Speaker Nancy Pelosi would say in a private meeting with Democrats on Wednesday that she was happy that she did it. And as a matter of fact, she felt, quote, liberated, end quote, after deliberately ripping it up. She said, quote, he shredded the truth, so I shredded his speech, end quote. Pelosi went on to tell House Democrats she thought that was the right thing to do at the time. So we have, it's the handshake versus the speech rip up versus, I don't know, Rush Limbaugh getting a Medal of Honor. What do you guys think about the State of the Union address? And let's start before we get to the content of the address with just what I think is what's going to be most people's takeaway is these kind of two image moments, the failed handshake and the ripping up of the address.
Well,
Yep.
Go ahead, Ken.
You go, Mike.
I was going to say, this is why sometimes I just want to go somewhere out of some desert island and not follow politics, because just such ridiculous crap on both ends, and that sucks us all in. And hey, I'm like that too. I watched the ripping up and very carefully. And what was it, pre-ripped or not? Oh, I don't know, but we'll find out.
Wait.
Kind of
was
thing.
it pre-ripped? In other words, is there a suggestion that she like perforated it? I didn't see that.
Oh yeah, there were talk. There's a ripping conspiracy that I saw in some quarters. Absolutely. Oh yeah.
Okay, we'll continue. I'm learning already.
Yeah.
And the people saying like, well, if you look, he didn't really shake Pence's hand, and maybe he just wasn't aware. And I gotta say, geez, people, who cares? If this is what you're focusing on, then you're focusing on the wrong things. I think what we need to focus on is the fact that the State of the Union, like with everything Donald Trump does, has become this sort of narcissistic campaign rally, sort of reality TV event. And I long for the pre-Wilsonian days when it was just delivered as a letter to the Congress.
The Jeffersonian method, yeah. What do you think about it, Kim?
I wouldn't like to be identified with Jeffersonian anything, but that's another.
Well, I mean, that's true. Anyway, just historically speaking, right? He's the one who ends it. Yeah. That's all. I'm not making you a Jefferson. Okay, so.
Thank you.
Kid, what did you think?
I agree with Michael. I also thought the speech was itself quite appalling, that it was, a combination of lies and vitriol and racism. And I think there were even some minor crimes committed during it, because I think
what were the crimes?
Yeah, I think a lot of these people that he used as props, and then he rewarded them in some way. Somebody he shows up and gets a scholarship, or shows up and gets some other kind of prize. I think he's basically using the resources of the United States government there as political props for his own campaign. Really, some of those stunts, and that does violate the Hobbs Act. I'm not expecting him to be prosecuted or impeached for it, but it seems like the same basic kind of conduct that he was just impeached for at a much lower level. But the idea of trying to use the U.S. military aid to get some political benefit out of the Ukrainian president, you take a sort of junior version of that, and it's using money from the United States Treasury to give a kid a scholarship whose father was killed by an immigrant or something. So it's the same kind of conduct, I think.
Yeah, it's more the kind of thing you'd expect to see on an episode of Oprah or something like that than the actual, look under your seat. You've just won a new car.
Yeah. And when resources are being paid out of the U.S. Treasury for that kind of stuff,
exactly,
that does make it illegal.
So now here,
I hadn't thought about it.
Well, and here's one of the things that made me think about this and want to talk about it. And that is not that I want to get too sucked into the, who do we side with or any of that. But what I noticed is that a lot of young, and so I'm curious about, especially from on your point, Mike, it seemed like these image moments were something that captured younger people's attention in a way that the impeachment and other things didn't. I can't tell you how many students were very interested. They hadn't been interested in anything, but they have comments and questions about Nancy Pelosi ripping up a speech or Donald Trump, not shaking Nancy Pelosi's hand. That seemed to really resonate because I think it was very much made for the image-based small text communication format. And so, you talk about wanting to go off in the desert island, and I can understand that. But do you think that these kinds of moments are maybe more important than we give them credit because we're downplaying their significance and just missing out how they're, I don't mean this as an insult, but memeable?
Yeah, I mean, there are moments more and more as the years go by that I just feel like we're essentially all doomed, and that everyone should pick up a copy of Brave New World and Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death and get thoroughly depressed along with me, because I think we see all this, playing out. And so, yeah, I think you may be right. And that's a horrifically depressing and sad sort of note, but I hope you're wrong.
Ken, what do you think? Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, I think you're right and wrong, because I think you're right about the phenomenon, but I don't know that it's significant. I think it may be that these trivial things become the conversation for a few days, but then those few days pass, and I don't think they have any real significant lasting impact on anything.
Why not?
That's a good. I'm glad you brought that up, Ken, because I want to agree with that, and I think you're right that any single event. But here's my concern is that if you string together enough of those, they crowd out so much of substance, and then so individually they're not a big deal, but collectively I think maybe they are, and maybe Trey, I don't know. I know. This is more your area, that maybe that's in part what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think a fact that these kinds of, as I'm kind of calling them, memeable moments, I think that's the only thing that fits through the primary communication channels that most of us see repeated over and over and over and over and over and over again. And so I would agree with you on that one, Mike, that it's that repetition of learning through these channels. And if this is what's going to make it on the channels and not, say, something longer and more substantive, I mean, ask somebody what the content of the State of the Union speech was, because it was in an hour, right? I mean, I defy us, if we were to go out into our respective cities and just start polling people in the downtown, if we could find anybody who even listened to 15 minutes of it or could give us one item from what he said. But I bet you anything that it would be somewhere in the 70% mark, the 80% mark, who could say, oh, yeah, she tore up the speech, or, oh, yeah, he didn't shake her hand.
Yeah, and my concern is more that people talk about that, and then they won't hear as much about, for instance, the administration retaliating against the state of New York and denying new global entry, applications because of their policy not to cooperate in certain ways with Homeland Security on driver's license checks. And so that's the kind of story where there are a number of moving parts, and there are some potentially reasonable cases maybe both sides can make, at least rhetorically, but it's more complex, and it's not memeable at all, I don't think, not so much as ripping up a speech. And that's the kind of stuff that really affects people in their everyday lives far more than any State of the Union will.
Yeah, I agree. But the reason I'm not as alarmed as Michael here, I guess, is even though I agree with Trey that probably many, many, many more people know about the ripping up and the not handshaking than know about the content of the speech. But I don't think anybody's missing anything by not knowing about the content of that speech. I think almost anyone's better off for not having heard that speech. I mean, and I also think there's no political impact, because I don't think anybody on either side, nobody who's inclined to vote for Trump, nobody's inclined to vote against Trump, nobody's undecided, is going to have their vote changed by that whole episode about the handshake and the paper tear.
Yeah.
I suppose that maybe I'd be more optimistic on your side if I thought that the things that were determining vote choice were going to be more substantive, which I think that's kind of what you're leaving there with. And while maybe that's not the moment that defines anybody's vote. I'm not sure if the thing that's going to define anybody's vote is much better.
Yeah, you may be right.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, it has been wonderful doing the show with you both. So we have the three guys today. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Mike and Ken. I want to remind listeners that if you are a supporter, the three of us are going to be doing a bonus show in just mere moments where we're going to put some odds on some candidates. And little do either of they know, I have a surprise question that I did not share with them that we're going to discuss on the bonus show. And for listeners, if you're interested in what that is, become a supporter, listen to the show, and you're going to get both of these gentlemen surprised. But I think maybe one of the most important, profound questions they have ever been asked. That will be on the bonus show. I also want to let you know, but by the time that you hear this, this is going to be ready for you on our supporters only page. We have other items like the quick take, and to become a supporter to get these kinds of bonus materials, all you have to do is check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or some random thought you want to share with us, you can always reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us, and we sometimes post things throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguys page. More recently, though, we've been working on Reddit, Bipartisan Politics, on Reddit. Additionally, you can follow us on Twitter at politicsguys. Know that subscribing to the show really does help, as does sharing this and your favorite episodes. You talking to other people is the best advertising we have, and we greatly appreciate it. So is leaving reviews and ratings on whatever podcast app, Spotify, you happen to be using. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Morano, Andra Masker, and Daniel Toe. Today's show was produced by myself, Ray Orndorff. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us then.